How's it going, and welcome back to Links to the Past, the series where I tell some backstory or lore from a Zelda game. Last week we looked at the siege of Akkala Citadel during the day of the Great Calamity before Breath of the Wild. Check that video out if you haven't already. And today we'll go with another story from this fateful day, the day the Calamity Ganon resurfaced in Hyrule and took control of the Guardians. But instead of looking at the crushing defeat of the Hylian army at the hands of the Sheikah machines in Akkala, we'll be looking at what was happening miles south of here, at what is remembered as the miracle at Fort Hateno. If you like this kind of video, be sure to show your support by dropping a like or subscribe if you're new. Like with the last video on the siege of Akkala Citadel, this video is based on information from the game, the ruins, NPCs, cutscenes, as well as information from the official Breath of the Wild Creating a Champion book. I've just written it up in a more cinematic way. So without further ado, let's go back 100 years to the day Hyrule fell, to the story of Fort Hateno's final defense. A 100 years after the events of the Great Calamity, when Hyrule fell, the winds blow gently through the thick, wild grass of Blatchery Plain. This great field lies sheltered on all sides by steep cliffs, and aside from the gentle breeze, the grassland lies still and quiet. The imposing shapes of the dueling peaks loom to the west, a mountain that long ago split into two halves, and through its chasm runs a well-worn footpath connecting the plain to central Hyrule. The decaying hulls of countless broken guardians litter Blatchery Plain, silent ruins of what were once war machines of unimaginable power. The remains of an ancient stone wall guard the path leading to the east, ruins which now sit buried in ivy and dirt, but long ago stood proud and tall. The shells of the guardians appear to be swarming towards the fortification, some even petrified halfway up the wall, as if time stopped while they were climbing it. The ruins of Fort Hateno tell a story, the story of hope in the darkness. During the nightmare that was the Great Calamity, when all of Hyrule collapsed into ruins around them, the haphazard defenders of Fort Hateno managed to halt the unrelenting assault of the Guardians, and protect the kingdom's few surviving civilians. Celessa, a traveller, believes that Fort Hateno was built to stop the assault of the Guardians 100 years ago. But this isn't true. The fortress wasn't built to withstand an attack from hundreds of godlike war engines. Nothing in Hyrule was. Even the great Akkala Citadel, the centre of Hyrule's military might, a castle built in such a way that it was considered completely impregnable, fell to the onslaught of the possessed machines during the Great Calamity. Fort Hateno was a simple gatehouse, likely only designed to control passage between the east and west Necluda region. It's built at a choke point at the edge of Blatchery Plain, and the lack of any permanent living quarters for soldiers suggests that they used to have to travel to the fort to work guard shifts. Unlike the mighty Akkala Citadel, a huge fortification with vast storerooms, armories and batteries of cannons, Fort Hateno was never meant to defend against a large-scale assault. Yet while Akkala Citadel was destroyed and its defenders slaughtered by the Guardians, Fort Hateno successfully prevented the Guardians from reaching Hateno village in the east, securing a future for the Hylian people. This tiny fortress, nothing more than a wall and a gatehouse, managed to halt the previously unstoppable hordes of possessed Sheikah titans. And the story of this defense is remembered, a century later, as the miracle of Fort Hateno. When the Calamity Ganon resurfaced from deep below Hyrule Castle and took control of the Guardians built to destroy it, it sent them out across the kingdom with one purpose: to utterly annihilate the entirety of Hyrule and its people. Moments after the Calamity Ganon appeared, hundreds and hundreds of corrupted machines began to pour out into Hyrule. The settlements closest to Hyrule Castle, such as Castletown, Lon Lon Ranch and Maybe Village, were flattened, likely even before the people knew what was happening, their houses brought down on top of them and the ruins scorched to ash. At the garrisons in Hyrule Field, the soldiers noticed the bright glow from the burning ruins of Castletown and prepared for battle. From both Hyrule Garrison and Colomo Garrison, the soldiers moved south, gathering civilians from smaller settlements like the Exchange and Gatepost Town before fleeing eastwards towards the dueling peaks. With Hyrule Field aflame behind them, the soldiers reached the mountains with the surviving civilians. But they weren't safe yet. The Guardians were moving south rapidly from the castle, bringing with them devastation on an unimaginable scale. The garrisons and towns were stomped into the dirt, and anyone still left in the field crushed or burned to death. The soldiers continued east, through the open Blatchery Plain, towards Fort Hateno. Once they reached the fortress, exhausted and terrified, they readied themselves for battle. Those who could not fight continued past the fort towards Hateno village, and anyone that could hold a bow was stationed along the wall of the fort. The portcullis was lowered, and the soldiers waited, weary, cold and frightened. The soldiers readied themselves, knocking arrows in their bows, praying to the goddess Hylia for help. And help was coming. While the soldiers were moving eastward with the civilians to Fort Hateno, a princess and a warrior fled from the castle. After seeing the Calamity Ganon resurface, Link and Zelda had travelled to Hyrule Castle to confront it. But when the Guardians were turned and the divine beasts corrupted, their champions killed, Zelda and her chosen knight were forced to run for the safety of Kakariko village, with hundreds of Guardians on their tail. With them, they guided any survivors left after the massacre at the capital. Men and women whose homes had been burned and their families slaughtered fled south under the protection of the princess and her knight. A normal knight would have had no chance. But this was no normal knight. This was a champion. Guardians in pursuit, Link and Zelda ran south through Hyrule Field, using the thick forests along the river as cover. As they fled, Guardians hounded them, yet the hero destroyed them one by one. With the power of the true Master Sword, Link broke the thick armour of the machines and ripped Ganon's malice from them, protecting the group of survivors. Night fell and the rain began to pour, and still the champion and the princess ran. The events of the horrific night were beginning to take their toll on the princess. Her people looked up to her, and in their time of need she failed to awaken her powers. She'd failed to summon the strength within her to push back the calamity, and because of this failure, her kingdom was in ruins. Link, exhausted, helped her to her feet and continued on towards Kakariko. This was no time for emotion. By this point, Link and Zelda had travelled miles, and the knight had fought and slain innumerable guardians. The two finally passed through the dueling peaks into Blatchery Plain, accompanied by their group of survivors, but the hero's strength was beginning to dwindle. In close pursuit was a horde of guardians, swarming behind them like locusts. The champion and the princess reached the fort safely, delivering the survivors behind its walls. But Zelda had to reach Kakariko village, the home of the Sheikah, in order to put in motion a plan to stop the calamity. The silence in the field didn't last long. Cruel purple lights lit up the night as the machines began swarming into the field from the dueling peaks, Ganon's malice burning from within them like a furnace. Although the thin pass through the dueling peaks bottlenecked the Guardians, they still poured into the plain en masse, spreading out and advancing on Fort Hateno. Due to the wall being situated in a choke point, the soldiers had a very narrow range with which they could target the huge mass of Guardians, firing volley after volley of arrows at them. Most arrows merely dented the thick armour of the machines, but the occasional lucky shot hit the eye, a weak point, heavily damaging or even disabling a Guardian completely. But despite this, their numbers were too many. The war engines got closer and closer to the defending wall, blinding bursts of blue light erupting from them, their lasers tearing through stone like it were paper, vaporizing scores of soldiers instantly. As men died on the front lines, more climbed up to replace them, and continuing the return fire on the Guardians. As stone was ripped from its foundations, makeshift wooden barricades were propped up to keep the Guardians out. Meanwhile, in the field, Link fought alone. The princess at his side, the hero battled Guardian after Guardian, breaking each one with sacred might, forging his path towards Kakariko. The ancient Master Sword was chipped and broken, his champion's tunic burned and frayed, but still Link fought on. But for every machine he destroyed, 10 more appeared. From the fort, the soldiers could see the warrior far out in the field, taking the fight to the ancient automata, a warrior of legend single-handedly bearing the brunt of the Guardian assault. His legendary strength and the power of the Master Sword meant that a heavily reduced number of the corrupted machines made it to the fort, but it was still too many for the soldiers' simple bows. The Guardians were too powerful and too numerous, and despite the rain of arrows upon them, they began to climb the wall of the fort, slowly but surely forcing their way through the Kingdom of Hyrule's last line of defence. Under Ash Swamp, half a day from Kakariko Village, Link finally collapsed. He was mortally wounded from countless skirmishes with the technological terrors, and heavily fatigued from travelling across Hyrule. The hero fell, resting on his sword, but the Guardians do not tire. A Sheikah machine appeared before him, and with the last of his strength he stood and shielded Zelda with his body. But something inside the princess stirred. This was her kingdom. These were her people. This was her chosen knight who had given his life to defend her. This was her hero, a man destined to protect her across all time. She felt the blood of the goddess run through her, a sacred warmth in her chest. The ancient power her mother had passed down to her, the power she desperately tried for years to awaken, was beginning to stir. She would not let her kingdom fall to a timeless evil. In the darkest night, in the middle of the most tragic battle the kingdom had ever seen, Zelda stepped out in front of the Guardian. Throwing Link behind her, she raised her hand. She was the reincarnation of the ancient goddess, and her power tore Ganon's malice out from the heart of the machine, extinguishing it and leaving behind an empty husk. Her power exploded across the field, a tidal wave of sacred light that broke the hold Ganon had on the Guardians. Every one of the ancient machines fell, one by one, the hatred that fueled them vanquished. The Guardians climbing the fort, seconds from overrunning and slaughtering its people, ceased to function, the lights from within fading to darkness. Zelda's power had awakened, and with it, she saved the Kingdom of Hyrule in its darkest hour. Hers was the miracle of Fort Hateno, the last light during the Great Calamity. The dust settled on a silent field. While mere moments ago the turf was being torn up by the many shunting legs of the Guardians, their empty shells now littered the field, unmoving and cold like great tombstones. The Battle of Fort Hateno was over, the Guardians frozen seconds from breaching the wall. The brave people of Hyrule had won a seemingly impossible battle with the help of the hero and Zelda's sacred power. Link was mortally wounded and was taken to the Shrine of Resurrection by the Sheikah, where he rested for a century. The survivors of the battle at the fort went on to live in Hateno Village, creating a life for themselves in the ruins of the kingdom. Zelda herself travelled to the castle to face Ganon alone. Though the sheer extent of the part he played in slowing the Guardian's approach is not known to many, Link's courage and the strength he showed that night is remembered a century later, as the legendary warrior of Fort Hateno. And while no one understands just what happened on that night, the power that saved the lives of hundreds is remembered only as the miracle of Fort Hateno. Thanks for watching this video. If you missed the first, check it out with the link in the description or card in the top right. If you like this video, please drop a like to show your support or subscribe for more Zelda content. Links to all the awesome music I used in this video can be found down below. Cheers guys, and I'll see you next time.